Realm presents Orphan Black, The Next Chapter, starring Tatiana Maslany. Episode 10.
Kira hugged herself and stamped her feet in the deepening snow. She couldn't stop shivering, but she wasn't sure if it was more due to the cold or to nervousness. She and her family had been through a lot, but that had been years ago. Kira was just a kid then, pretty much dragged along and shuffled around without any say in what happened, or what happened to her. Protected. Some of the details seemed hazy now, and her aunts rarely talked about those days anymore. Yet Kira had always felt they could probably handle anything that came at them, as long as they worked together. The world knew about clones now. Rogue scientists were trying to wipe out everyone in the small village of Nazwineg just to test a weapon. The same weapon that had already killed a man, basically right in front of Kira and Emmeline. And those same scientists seemed willing to kill anyone who got in their way. Kira had already failed to save Gilles Sauveterre, whose horrifying death still haunted Kira and Emmeline both. And now they thought they could protect everyone else in his village? An arm settled over her shoulder. "Cold?" Emmeline asked. Kira's face grew flushed. She stopped shivering, but now her heart was racing. "Not anymore." "It's gonna be okay," Em said. Kira appreciated the attempt to reassure her, but then Em said, more softly, "Isn't it?" Kira nodded. "It is. Help is coming." She checked the phone clutched in her gloved hand. Eventually. Where were they? As if on cue, she saw two bright specks in the distance. Headlights. Kira squinted, but the snow and darkness made it impossible to make out the vehicle. Em's arm slid away from Kira's shoulders. "Maybe we should hide until we're sure it's them." Kira shrugged. Who else would be out here at this time of night, in the middle of a snowstorm? The headlights grew closer, much faster than she would have expected in foot-deep snow. They also seemed much higher off the ground than they should be. Maybe it was a snowplow out clearing the roads? Suddenly, it was upon them, and it wasn't a plow or the purple Prius she had been hoping for. It wasn't even a car. It was some kind of all-terrain vehicle in green-brown camo, built like a freaking tank on large snow-crusted tires. It looked military. "Shit! Run!" Kira grabbed Em's gloved hand in hers and turned to run. They had only made it a dozen feet away when she heard a familiar voice calling out her name. "Kira?" Kira stopped, and a moment later, a spotlight fell on her and Em. She shielded her eyes and blinked at the figure waving at her from the ATV's open passenger door. He slipped and fell on his ass in the snow, shouting, "Bloody hell!" And then Kira was certain it was Uncle Felix. Felix slowly climbed to his feet, brushing off his long black coat. She didn't realize she was running across the road toward him until he made an oof sound and rocked back against the vehicle's oversized tire. Kira had forgotten for a moment that she wasn't a kid anymore. She hugged him ferociously, and to her utter embarrassment, her eyes burned with tears. She hid her face in his shoulder, hoping Em wouldn't see. "Hey," he said, thumping her soothingly between the shoulder blades like he had when she was small. "Hey, monkey, you all right?" Kira laughed weakly. He was pretty much the only person who she didn't mind using her old nickname. "Chin up. I bring reinforcements," he said, "and supplies." Kira took a shaky breath, pulled herself together, and drew back as two women hopped down from the back of the ATV. Vivian Valdez and Dana Emmett. Both of them were the same unnerving combination of strange and all too familiar. One with blunt-cut red hair that flared behind her as the wind picked up, the other with hair the same natural brown as all the other clones. Their appearance was even more unsettling because they were younger than her mom and her aunts, and older than Charlotte. "Hi," Kira waved and then felt silly for it. "I'm Kira Manning. This is Emmeline Francis," she added when Emmeline reached her side. Em tugged down her scarf and gave a winning smile and a sheepish little wave of her own that made Kira feel a rush of affection. Felix's gaze slid back to Kira's face, and one of his eyebrows shot upward. He had always been way too perceptive. "Vivi," said the red-headed clone. So this was the American spy who had been investigating that explosion at Grit and Aunt Cosima. Now she was supposedly working with them? Kira narrowed her eyes and found that Vivi was sizing her up too. The woman seemed unimpressed by what she saw. The second clone reached over to shake Kira's hand. "Hey, I'm Dana. It's nice to meet you." She shook M's next. "And this is Felix Dawkins, my uncle." Kira felt weirdly nervous about introducing M and him to each other. "Hi. Cool monster truck," M said. "Thanks, but it isn't mine," Felix sniffed. Of course he would never own something like this. He turned and called back into the front of the vehicle. "Well, since when are you shy?" Kira frowned, suddenly wondering who the driver was, and coming to the conclusion that her mother had managed to get in on this mission after all, against Kira's wishes. She felt herself tense up with anxiety and anger. The driver's side door opened and shut on the far side of the ATV, and then someone came around the front of the vehicle, a woman wearing a fur hat with ear flaps that didn't quite contain her wild, curly blonde hair and a puffy white parka. Kira couldn't believe her eyes as the new arrival trudged toward them slowly, her face even paler than usual in the headlight beams. M gasped. "Hello, Snow Angel," Helena said to Kira with a broad smile. "Auntie Helena!" They hugged. Helena gave the best hugs. They were strong and fierce like her, so it felt like she was simultaneously protecting you from anything that could harm you and clinging to you for dear life. "What are you doing here? When did you get back?" Kira asked. "Wanted to surprise you." Helena's eyes widened and she did jazz hands. "Surprise." Kira laughed. "When I got back from trip, I found shit mess. So I came straight home to clean it up," Helena said. "But why are you here?" Kira asked. "Who's better at surviving in a place like this?" Helena slapped a hand against her chest. She leaned forward and said loudly, "And between you and me, I keep eye on you, sisters." She winked conspiratorially. Kira glanced at Vivi and Dana doubtfully. "We heard that," Vivi said. "I know." Helena crossed her arms, an annoyed look on her face. Kira had the impression that the drive up hadn't been entirely pleasant. "Also, I am not your sestra," Vivi said. "I know this too, but we are still family, whether you want or not." Helena looked at Kira pointedly. "And I'm here to keep my family alive." "Oh, I can take care of myself, thanks." Vivi put her hands on her hips, and Kira noticed the gun holstered there. Of course, Vivi had a gun. But seeing the sidearm, even in the hands of someone who claimed to be on Kira's side, did not make her feel any safer. Far from it. "We will be seeing," Helena said. "Helena, this is my friend Emmeline," Kira said. Helena looked back and forth between them. "More than friends, yes?" Kira said. "I am going to die right now," she thought. "Now, Helena," Felix said. "Remember what we've been working on. It's often better that we not say the first thing that pops into our heads, especially in your case." "That was not the first thought popping into my head," Helena smirked. "We're colleagues," Kira jumped in. "Em and I work together." "Good to meet you." Helena grabbed an unsuspecting M into a hug. "Oh, okay, we're doing this." M laughed. "Nice to meet you, too." That was as much an acceptance from Helena as anyone could hope for. Helena released M, who now looked a little dazed. "Okay, now that intros are over, listen up," Vivi said. Dana rolled her eyes. We're here to stop Kurtzman from deploying his weapon in Nazweeneg and killing every man, woman, and child who was born there. If we're going to succeed without getting ourselves killed, I need all of you to do exactly as I tell you. Vivi looked hard at each of them, only avoiding Helena. Not almost exactly, but exactly. No improvising, no stupid heroics, unless I specifically assign you stupid heroics. She paused and glanced at Dana worriedly. It was only a brief moment, but it was nice to see a glimpse of human emotion from her. If you follow my instructions, even as strange as some of them will sound, then you're all going to be fine. Vivi finished. Helena let out a short laugh. Kira was beginning to understand the stressed-out expression Felix had been wearing since he'd arrived. She wanted to believe it when Vivi said, "You're all going to be fine." But when Kira was a kid, Mrs. S. and her mom and Felix and basically every other adult had constantly told her not to worry. She would be fine. Everything was going to work out. Instead, Kira had learned there were degrees of fine, and not everything worked out for everyone. "Did you have something to say, Helena?" Vivi smirked.
"I have been thinking about your plan, and I have a better idea,"
Helena said. "Really?"
"Really. My idea is like yours, only smarter and safer."
"I can't wait to hear this brilliant revelation." Helena rubbed her hands together.
"Yes, but first thing is first. I am hungry for snack."
Felix sighed. Kira laughed. She had missed her wacky family. Greg Kurtzman's plans had not included a snowstorm. He only saw white outside the helicopter, and he doubted the view was much different from the cockpit. Didn't make him feel optimistic about landing anytime soon. "I can't feel my feet," grumbled Evans, one of the hired guns sitting in the back. The thrumming of the rotors was loud, but regrettably, he was still audible over them. The other 4 thugs had been professional enough to ride along in silence, but Evans hadn't shut up the entire trip. If it weren't bad for morale, Greg would have kicked him out of the copter somewhere over Lake Ontario. Greg wasn't even supposed to know Evans' name, or the name of anyone else on this covert mission, but the idiot had introduced himself when he climbed on board. "We couldn't have done this in the spring," Evans went on. Greg scowled at the reminder that spring had been the original target date for testing the genetic weapon, before things had literally blown up on him. Fucking Sturgis.
"At least these babies aren't tropical,"
said Thug Number 1, patting one of the several locked carrier boxes. Evans leaned forward and raised his voice, as though Greg hadn't heard every insipid word he'd said for the last hour. "Are you sure we shouldn't be wearing protective gear? If these things can find their way through all their winter clothes." "Unless your grandmother came from this village and you didn't tell us, you're fine. That's the whole point of genetic targeting," Greg said. Greg pulled his headset on to silence Evans for a while and spoke to the pilot. "How are we doing?"
"I think we're almost there,"
the pilot said.
"You think?"
That didn't instill a lot of confidence.
"Look outside, man. These are no-viz conditions. It's too dangerous to even attempt a landing with no ground reference. I say we turn back until this clears up."
"That's not an option," Greg said.
"We have one chance at this."
It's my last chance to test this weapon and eliminate the Nazweeneg threat, Greg thought. Between the fucking clone spook stealing the software he needed to code the mosquitoes for their genetic targets, and her ex-boss, Davis, breathing down his neck, Greg had to get this done now, or his boss was going to have his ass. He did not want to disappoint Eloise Thibault.
"Fine, but I'm going to have to put us down farther from the village. I see a good landing spot and I'm going for it while I can. Everyone hold on to something."
The rhythm and hum of the rotors shifted. Suddenly, the helicopter pitched forward and lurched to the left, and then Greg's stomach lurched into his throat as they dropped. After what seemed to be a long time but had to have only been a couple of seconds, the helicopter righted itself. Greg white-knuckled the armrests as the helicopter shuddered and hit the ground with a jolt. The rotors whined down and the copter tilted backward. "You call that a landing?" Evans shouted. The pilot twisted around in his seat. "Hey, we're alive, that's a good landing." "How far are we from the village?" Greg asked. "About 5 kilometers, the pilot said. Evans groaned. "Time to move out," Greg said. "The sooner we get this done, the sooner we can go home." Easy for you to say, Evans said. You aren't going out there. Remember who's in charge. Greg drew his gun. You're being paid an absurd amount to open a damn briefcase and shut your mouth. Especially that second part. Evans opened his mouth. One of his partners shook his head. Evans closed his mouth. Good choice, Greg said. It was Greg's prerogative to stay behind and coordinate the mission. Besides, he didn't want to be seen around the village in case the test didn't work or someone survived who could identify him. He hated working in the field, but he needed to be hands-on with this one to make certain of success. The village is northeast of here. Like we planned, each of you head to your section of the village. When you're all in position, I'll signal you to open your briefcases and release the mosquitoes. I'll be monitoring from here. Greg patted his own briefcase. The tiny mechanical mosquito drones couldn't hold a battery charge for long, limiting their range. So it was necessary to deploy them as broadly as possible to cover Neswineg and infect as many people as possible while they were sleeping. And then they needed to collect all the mosquitoes before they ran out of power, so no one could trace things back to Greg and his associates. The snow wasn't going to make any of that easier. After Evans and the others left with their steel briefcases, the pilot closed the helicopter door. He started doing his system check to prepare for their later departure while Greg opened his own briefcase, which contained a 5-inch display, keyboard, and radio receiver. He watched the 4 blinking green dots representing his team move slowly away from his location. Each of their cases was equipped with a transceiver, which would relay the signals from the drones back to Greg's console. He watched the dots creep farther away, trying to remember what the range of the radio transceivers was. If the signal faded as they reached the village, Greg would have to head out, after all, to cut the distance. Hey, boss, I think there's someone out there, the pilot said. Greg checked his screen again. If someone was outside the helicopter, it wasn't one of his people. Who would be wandering around at this time of night on the edge of the forest? Greg moved up to the cockpit to check it out. Turn on the lights, he said, peering through the window. The pilot flicked a switch, and the searchlight outside came on. He swiveled it around slowly. Greg saw a flash of red. There, go back, he barked. The light swung around. No fucking way, Greg said. A woman was illuminated in the spotlight. That bitch with the bright red hair. Open the door. Greg grabbed his pistol again and pulled back on the slide to load a bullet in the chamber. He made his way to the door and peered out into the snow. Vivi Valdez was just standing there, one hand up to shield her eyes from the light. Greg cocked the gun and aimed, but just as he had her in his sights, she stepped into the shadows. The spotlight moved to try to track her. He hopped out of the copter. The snow was already ankle-deep. Icy cold seeped into his Gore-Tex sneakers as he squinted and tried to spot Valdez. Then something struck his arm, and he dropped his gun into the snow. The muzzle flashed as the gun fired loudly, briefly illuminating Valdez's face. How? She swept her leg behind him and slammed the palm of one hand into his chest. He fell back and down, banging his head on the threshold of the helicopter. Got you, Valdez said. Something clicked above Greg's head. And I've got you, the pilot said. Valdez looked up coolly. That's a flare gun. It'll still hurt like hell. I'm a very good shot. Step away from him. Valdez sighed, taking a few steps back. Don't kill her, yet. Greg pulled himself up with a grunt. He bent over and fished around in the snow until his fingers brushed the slippery, cold metal of his gun. He didn't know if it would still fire while wet, but he loaded another bullet and aimed it at Valdez anyway. Where's my thumb drive? He asked. You mean this? She reached into her pocket. Easy there. The pilot jumped down and moved closer, still pointing the flare gun at her. Valdez slowly drew her hand out. The silver drive glinted between her index and middle fingers. Take that from her, Greg said. Valdez dropped the thumb drive into the snow at the pilot's feet. Oops, she said. Come on. The pilot slowly bent his knees and reached for the thumb drive. Valdez kicked at his head. He leaned back so her boot only grazed his head, but he lost his balance and fell in the snow. Shit! Greg fired his gun as she dove, scooped up a handful of snow, and ran toward the helicopter. Greg aimed again. Stop, the pilot said. You don't want to shoot at my helicopter. She's getting away. Valdez ducked under the helicopter and disappeared.
She got away,
Greg said.
He checked the ground in front of the pilot, but of course the drive was gone.
Follow her, he growled. He gestured for the pilot to head around the front of the helicopter while he went around the back. In the dim light from the helicopter's searchlight and running lights, they saw 2 identical women with red hair.
What the hell?
The pilot asked.
Clones, remember?
Greg said. The 2 Valdezes split up and disappeared into the tree line.
You take the one on the right, I'll go after the one on the left,
Greg said.
I should stay with the copter,
the pilot said.
Don't be a coward, move it.
Greg swapped his gun for a flashlight and ran after his clone, hoping it was the real Valdez, while the pilot chased after the second target. Fortunately, their footprints were clear in the snow. Greg pulled out his walkie-talkie to communicate with the team.
There are at least 2 clones out here. Be on the lookout in the village. Don't let anyone interfere with the plan. Stay in touch.
He wiped snow and sweat from his eyes with the back of a hand. At least the storm was starting to let up.
Shoot them on sight, but don't touch anything until I get there to search the body. I really don't think you should do this,
Art said for the gazillionth time. Jess at us sighed. You've made that very clear. She leaned against the granite-topped kitchen island and glanced at the door, wondering how many people in the adjoining living room were eavesdropping on them right now.
This Davis guy is dangerous. Allison said he tried to kill the clones in the hospital, the sick clones in the hospital, Jay, including my daughter, Charlotte. We can be pretty sure he's not acting in good faith.
Yes, Art, bad guy, I get it. But Davis has already been in touch with my superiors. He said he's just looking to share information and we need all the information we can get. Jessica locked eyes with Art. Dangerous or not, this is my job. And I am damn good at my job. Art's expression softened.
You're right. You're absolutely right. Okay. But if you go, I'm coming with you.
I wasn't asking for your permission, and you don't get to dictate terms, she said mildly. He was taken aback.
I'm sorry.
And I appreciate the offer, but don't your friends need you here?
They're fine. You've seen the paparazzi surrounding this house. Couldn't ask for better security, and whether you admit it or not, you need backup.
He flashed one of his rare smiles.
I got you.
Jessica cocked a hip. Oh, I need backup, do I? He laughed and held up his hands.
Not as much as I need to do something right now. Anything that can help my family. And if Davis is a threat to the clones, I'd like to see him myself.
From anyone else, that whole macho act would have been infuriating, but with Art, it was kind of cute. She was surprised to find him so charming, but apparently the sensitive, caring type was her thing. She just didn't encounter guys like that all that often. Art had his own reasons to be involved. He seemed to care about Jessica, for one. But they came from a good place, and she knew he wanted justice as much as she did. And honestly, she wouldn't mind some company on the long drive, especially if it were him. Okay, Jessica smiled. Let's go. Kira M. and Dana huddled in the snow behind a tree and watched Kurtzman and his goon disappear into the snow, chasing after Vivi and Helena.
That was going to be me in the wig before Helena turned up,
Dana said.
I could have been shot.
Vivi didn't mention that Kurtzman wanted to kill her when she suggested impersonating her, Kira said.
I thought I knew the risks, but...
Dana trailed off and looked into the distance, in the direction Vivi had run.
I guess I figured if Vivi could handle it, I could too, since we're clones.
Just because you're clones doesn't mean you're the same person, Kira said.
I know. My cousins and I, we're all different, but we still have a lot in common.
You all grew up together? Kira asked. Dana nodded.
We've always been best friends. We shared everything.
Maybe that's why we have so many similarities. Vivi, she left. She was taken away when we were little. She grew up on her own. She forgot about us. But I never forgot about her. Vivi also has had super spy training. Maybe you could do everything she can with the same training, maybe not. I doubt my mom could ever be the scientist Cosima is, or a musician like Allison. But she has her own skills. And flaws. I hate to interrupt, but... Em stood, crusted snow tumbling from her jacket. She'd been watching Vivi and Helena and Dana's interactions with obvious fascination. Kira could tell she'd a lot of questions, but there'd be time for all that later. Hopefully. We do have to search that helicopter while the bad guys are gone. Em kept impressing Kira with the way she handled herself under stress and rolled with each new mind-boggling development. It made her hope Em wouldn't decide Kira's life was too complicated for her to remain mixed up with. Kira stood too. Be careful. Someone else might have stayed behind, and Kurtzman and his friend may come back at any moment. They snuck up to the helicopter cautiously, skirting the edges of the still blazing spotlight. Kira peeked through the windows, but it appeared to be empty. Do we know what we're looking for? Dana whispered. If it's in there, we'll know it when we see it, Kira said. They opened the door and climbed inside. Ah, Em said. Warm at last. Warmer, anyway, Dana said. Maybe that's why Kurtzman hung out here. Maybe, Kira said. But Vivi had insisted Kurtzman would have some way to control the mosquitoes based on what she'd seen back in the black box facility. If that were true, they could stall the attack and save the Nezwineg right here and now. They climbed into the helicopter and looked around. Em was the one who found the open briefcase with a 5-inch screen and a keyboard. She hunched over it as she pecked at the keys. I think we hit the jackpot. Kira and Dana crowded around Em. The screen showed 4 blips northeast of their location, moving apart from one another. Isn't that where the village is? Em pointed at the cluster of dots. Are those the mosquitoes? Kira asked. I thought they'd have more than 4 of them. Em tapped at the keyboard and managed to switch to another readout. The screen showed the words, standby, drone status inactive, awaiting telemetry. Can we stop the mosquitoes with this thing? Dana asked. I don't think so. It's just a display. This terminal can't broadcast a signal, Em said. Couldn't you, hack it or whatever? Em rolled her eyes. All teenagers aren't hackers, you know. I can't hack computers, but my dad taught me how to build stuff, Kira said. I could probably make a short-range electromagnetic pulse device that could fry the mosquitoes if I had the tools, equipment, and time. None of which we have, Dana said. But we do have a handy way to track the drones attacking the village. We can use this to tell our people where they are and intercept them, Kira said. The screen flashed. What was that? What did you do? Dana asked. Nothing, Em said. The word standby changed to deploying, and the drone status updated to active. Not me. I'm not doing this. Em lifted her hands away from the keyboard. Do something, Dana said. I can't. I don't even know what's happening. More dots began appearing on the screen, tiny red dots flowing away from the larger dots like swarming insects. The message, receiving telemetry, popped up. Kira reached over and tapped one of the clouds of red dots. The display zoomed in to show a close-up of dozens of dots spreading out, spreading into the village. Oh shit, Kira said. Those are the mosquitoes. She closed the briefcase and picked it up. We have to move. What? Where? Dana asked. To the village. The mosquitoes were just released, which means whoever released them carried them in and then turned them on. So maybe whatever they used to transport them has a way to turn them off, too. Em snapped her fingers. And we know where they are. It was like Kira and Em were operating on the same wavelength, the way Cosima and Delphine did when they were doing science-y stuff. Kira enjoyed having someone around who got her so effortlessly. They all moved toward the helicopter door. Kira savored the last of the warmth for a moment before they plunged back outside. It seemed even colder following their brief reprieve, but at least the storm was clearing up. I'll text Vivi, Dana said as they hurried toward Neswineg. "And I'll call Uncle Felix," Kira said. "Then I suggest we run. We have to contain the mosquitoes before it's too late." Felix flinched at the loud buzzing sound, swinging his bug zapper racket around. Vivi had bought a set of them on the road, the closest they could get to the cattle prod that had nuked the mosquitoes in Sturgis's lab. But the buzzing wasn't coming from a mosquito. It was the phone in his pocket. He pulled it out, only the screen was dark. It took him a moment to figure out why. He lifted the polarized glasses Vivi had given him to make the tiny bugs more visible, and voila, he could see the screen again. It was Kira calling. "The mosquitoes are out," Kira said as soon as he answered. "I've just noticed, darling." Silver flashed on his right, and he swung with the racket in his other hand. Sparks crackled as the tiny drone he had hit short-circuited, and a burst of electricity arced through the air, connecting with two nearby mosquitoes in a mini lightning strike. It was kind of pretty. He lowered his glasses and looked around nervously, watching for more of the pests. "And we know where they're coming from, and there might be a way to deactivate or recall them. We're on our way to the Neswineg. Any luck waking people up?" Kira sounded short of breath, like she was running. "I'm not the most popular person right now, but the village is awake and grouchy." People eyed him warily from their windows. He'd run through the streets shouting at people to get out of bed and get ready for an attack, feeling like a modern-day Paul Revere. Only he was a British man, warning people about the Canadians, who were apparently attacking with robotic mosquitoes. Yeah, he probably would have told himself to bugger off too, and then gone back to sleep. Felix crouched and scooped up one of the burnt-out mosquitoes from the snow. This might help convince them he wasn't making this shite up. Then he looked up and saw the air shimmering in front of him. He blinked. Was the snowstorm picking up again? No, it was a fucking cloud of mosquitoes heading straight for him. The air hummed with the whir of their miniature mechanical wings. "Kira, I have to call you back." Felix tucked away his phone, gripped the electrified paddle with both hands, and started swinging wildly as the bugs swept over him. Jessica drove up to the abandoned high school slowly, with the car's headlights off. Lying in the back seat, Arthur Bell lifted his head and glanced out the window.
"Friendly place,"
Art said. "Get your head down," Jessica snapped. "You know better than that." Art opened his mouth for a snappy comeback, then changed his mind and settled back in the seat. "Davis might see you," she said.
"I thought the whole point of arriving early was to be here before Davis."
"I don't want to take any chances," she said.
"If that were true, we wouldn't be here."
"Don't remind me." Jessica drove around the dark, graffiti-covered building slowly.
"How'd you know about this place, anyway?"
Art asked. "I thought everyone knew about it. I grew up near here. When I was in high school, kids used to sneak in to take pictures and... explore," she finished.
"I bet,"
he said.
"I used to bust kids for trespassing in places like this. Certainly doesn't look safe in there. You don't seem like the urban explorer type."
"I used to be quite adventurous," she sighed, until she and her boyfriend had been busted by a cop like Art. Her parents had been less upset about what she had been doing than they were by who she was doing it with. "Anyway, we aren't going inside. Not really. I'm going to meet Davis on the old football field." She slowed the car down. "This is your stop. The bleachers should give you a decent view of everything."
"Okay,"
Art said.
"Be careful."
"I am. That's why I let you come with me." She winked at him in the rearview mirror. Art slipped out, closing the door so softly she barely heard it. So he could be sneaky when he needed to be. But she had known that, based on everything he'd been keeping from her during her investigation, based on his track record in the force too. But since the clones had been exposed, since he'd come clean with Jessica and started working with her, really working with her, he'd been sharing everything. Probably too much, as though he wanted to make up for his lies by not holding anything back. Or maybe he just enjoyed talking with someone who understood what a life in law enforcement meant. She certainly did. And she enjoyed having the upper hand, together with Art. She drove the car around the school once more, When she reached the entrance again, a black sedan was parked there in the spot where she'd let Art out. She glanced toward the bleachers, but she couldn't see any sign of him, which hopefully meant Davis wouldn't spot him either. She figured Art was exactly where he was supposed to be, and now it was her turn. She trudged across the overgrown football field, slipping back 20 years to the last time she'd been on these grounds. Back then, as a rebellious youth, she never could have seen herself as a police officer. But she hadn't really seen herself in any job at the time. She hadn't thought much about the future at all. Cigarette smoke tainted the crisp night air, and where there's smoke, there's... Up ahead, she saw the shadow of a figure and the glowing tip of a cigarette. How had Davis gotten there so fast? He must have been in his 60s, and the doughy white man didn't look to be in the best shape. Every instinct in her told her she should leave, but she couldn't just turn around now. Art was out there watching her back as he'd promised. She had to watch his too. She was just getting cold feet. She could handle this. They could. Together. "Alexander Davis?" Jessica asked when she was within earshot. He flicked his cigarette into the field with a flare of sparks and reached into the right pocket of his trench coat. Her fingers twitched for her gun, but he pulled out a pack of cigarettes and a lighter, his hands strangely awkward. He lit another cigarette, the flame of his lighter creepily illuminating the crags and wrinkles in his face, like he was about to tell her a scary story. Maybe he was. He had a brace on his right wrist. Jessica wondered if it concealed a weapon.
"Good evening, Sergeant Priantha,"
Davis said.
"Thank you for coming."
"I'm here. Now what do you want? You said information, but is that all?"
"I think you know what I want. Since you and your colleagues haven't managed to apprehend the rogue spy I warned you about, I had to come up to deal with her myself."
Jessica was pretty sure she would have found that sketchy even if she hadn't known what she knew about Davis. Why would someone this old and high-ranking come out to personally search for a missing operative?
"What can you tell me about your case so far? Any clues that might help me locate her?"
Davis pulled on his cigarette. "Not a lot, I'm afraid," she said, trying to sound sympathetic. "As a matter of fact, I thought I had apprehended her, but..." She coughed into her hand. "Surely you're aware by now that Agent Valdez is one of these clones that have been on the news." His eyes gleamed.
"So you arrested the wrong clone. Which one was it? Is she still in captivity?"
That was a creepy word to use. "You mean custody? No. Once we realized she wasn't your spy, we let her go."
"I see."
He stepped closer to her.
"You know, I was wondering if Valdez, who is, after all, a CIA-trained operative, might have gone to ground with these other clones to sow confusion, blend in, as it were."
"Makes sense," Jessica agreed cautiously.
"Any idea where these clones might be?"
Davis asked it casually, but Jessica had to force herself to calm her breathing. Was it a trap? Did he know she'd come directly from Cosima Niehouse's place? She managed to laugh. "Just follow the cameras and news trucks." Davis frowned.
"Let's try another topic,"
he said, taking a step closer.
"Have you had any breakthroughs on the grip bombing?"
"As it turns out, your agent was cleared of that particular act," Jessica said.
"Oh?"
"Yeah, it kind of got lost in the press, what with the human clones and all, but it was Nathaniel Sturgis, the director of Grit."
"Sturgis,"
Davis hissed.
"What's Valdez to you? Why are you protecting her?"
What was Valdez to Jessica? Not a friend, certainly. She had been instrumental in rescuing Niehaus, and she had volunteered to go defend the Neswineg. So for the moment, she was an ally. Davis, by contrast, had tried to kill a bunch of sick clones. So even though they were both foreign spies on her territory, Jessica knew which one she was siding with. "Valdez is a dead end, as far as my investigation goes," she said, trying to sound reasonable and fearless. "I don't know much about her. Why did she go rogue? Why do you want her back so bad? Must be important if they sent someone like you out here to get her."
"No one sent me. I came here myself. I don't like loose threads. My entire career has been built on tying them off and keeping the agency and the nation safe."
Davis dropped his cigarette and suddenly drew a gun from his sleeve, training it on Jessica.
"And now, Sergeant, I'm sorry to inform you that you're one of them. I'll ask you one last time. Do you know where Valdez is? Think very carefully before you answer.
A shot rang out. Davis whirled, looking about him wildly until he focused on the bleachers 100 meters away. Giassetta ran toward Davis. The best prey was one that thought itself a predator. Helena silently followed the stupid helicopter man through the forest. It was easy with the noise he made, pushing through the branches and cursing and sometimes firing his gun into the darkness to make himself feel better. His flashlight beam swung wildly back and forth, betraying nervousness. Helena didn't need a light to see her way in the dark. And anyway, the morning was slowly turning gray as dawn approached.
Stupid helicopter man leads me in circles, following my trail as I follow him, like worms swallowing on tail.
This was a fun distraction, but hardly difficult compared to the challenge of hiking in the Yukon or raising 2 wild boys on her own. Not really on her own, with her sestras around to help. But for the last few months in the mountains, it had been just the 3 of them against nature. They had often played survival games like this for days and days. Helena was proud that sometimes Arthur and Donnie had successfully tracked her for a change, and they had brought back and cooked dinner every night. They could have stayed there forever, but roasted squirrel couldn't compare to junk food, so Helena had decided it was time to come back. And she had missed the rest of her family. She often preferred to be on her own, but it was nice to have a welcoming home to return to. Leaving for a time made her appreciate everything she had more when she came back. Of course, while she was gone this time, everything in the world had gone to shit. And she was here to help fix some of that. The sooner she finished toying with this man, the sooner she could get back to her boys and their life in Toronto with her sestras. Helena picked up her pace, closing the gap between her and stupid helicopter man. She also wanted to keep a closer eye on that new sestra, Vivi Valdez. She was helping them, but also keeping herself cold and distant, which meant she was probably hiding something. Perhaps she just didn't trust other clones yet, but Helena knew what that was like, and Vivi Valdez was different. Whatever she claimed to be doing, she was doing it for herself, and Helena couldn't trust her until she knew what that was. Helena hadn't killed anyone in a very long time, but if the American spy fucked over her sestras, she would regret it. Helena crept up behind her prey and tapped him on the shoulder. Startled, he jumped and spun around. He gaped at Helena for a moment and froze. Boo. Helena raised her arms and lunged for him. He stumbled and fell backward on his ass in the snow. He fumbled his gun up and aimed it at her, hands shaking. Helena swatted his gun away. She spit on him.
You want to kill innocent village people? Children?
Not me. I just fly the helicopter. He was the worst kind of killer. One who never even saw his victims. The kind who would shoot someone in the back in the dark rather than face them. He lunged for Helena. Oh, he had some fight in him after all. But that was a big mistake. Sometimes the best prey was the kind that came to you. Helena kicked him in the chest and he fell to his left side. He rolled away from her. She reached down for him and he flung snow into her eyes. She snarled. Momentarily blinded, she groped about and grabbed hold of his jacket. She swung him around into a tree head first. She wasn't going to kill him, probably, but she would make sure he couldn't follow her or ever fly a helicopter again. Giassetta tried to tackle Davis, but he spun toward her faster than she expected and slammed his gun into her cheekbone. She stumbled away, going down on one knee. But when she looked up through the pain, Davis was holding his wrist and grimacing, the gun limp. She readied herself for another attack, but then Art was there, weapon aimed at Davis's head. "Drop the gun and put your hands up," Art shouted. Davis lifted his hands slowly, his gun still dangling from one finger. "Drop it," Art repeated. Davis did. Giassetta exhaled.
You okay, Jay?
Art asked. "I'm fine," she said. "Reasonably impressed with you." Art snorted.
Come on.
He gestured with his gun for Davis to walk back toward their cars. Davis sighed, but complied. Art scooped up the man's gun from the field without taking his eyes or his weapon off Davis.
Can I light another cigarette at least?
Davis asked. "No," Giassetta and Art said at the same time.
What should we do with him?
Art asked. Kill him? Jessica said.
Jay,
Art said. I'm kidding. We arrest him, charge him with attempted bribery, espionage. Jessica rubbed her chin. You have a lot of explaining to do.
give me a break.
Davis said.
You don't have a case against me. In fact, you don't even have me. How do you figure, big guy?
Art asked. Because we have you, a woman's voice said from the darkness. A blonde-haired white woman popped up from behind Davis's car and leveled a gun over the hood at Art. Jessica slowly reached for her own gun.
Stop moving,
another voice said to her left. A black man with a military buzz cut and cliché black suit stepped out from behind Jessica's car, pointing a gun at her.
You didn't think I would come here alone either, did you?
Davis laughed.
Only it looks like I brought better backup.
Toss your gun over here, the blonde said.
Shit.
Art tossed his gun to her feet. Jessica crept her fingers toward the gun in her holster. Hoping they wouldn't see what she was doing, she slowly lifted the clasp and eased the gun out.
Toss your gun over too,
Buzzcut said. Jessica pretended to fumble her gun for a moment and then tossed it toward him. He picked it up and pocketed it. So much for a harmless exchange of information, Jessica said to Davis. She kept her voice light, under control, but her palms went icy and her cheek was throbbing where Davis had hit her. She'd thought she'd been so clever getting here early, knowing the terrain. None of it had helped.
Go back to your friends and tell them to prepare to make a trade,
Davis said. What? Jessica asked. What kind of trade?
I want the weapon. You know the one I'm talking about, and if you don't, Valdez will. Tell her to bring it to me, or I'll extradite Mr. Bell here to a CIA black site under suspicion of terrorism.
No, Jessica said. I'll come with you if you let him go.
Sorry, Sergeant. From what I've managed to learn, Mr. Bell's absence will motivate the clones to cooperate with me more than yours will. Besides, on balance, I'd rather piss off the Border Patrol than the Mounties.
He leveled his gun at her.
And while I'm on the subject, I will know if you contact the authorities. One whiff of that, and he's on a plane to a third world country with extremely lax interrogation laws. Don't worry about me, Jay,
Art said, as Blondie secured his hands behind his back with a zip tie.
Keep my family safe. Finally, I'm dealing with an adult,
Davis said.
Get him in the car.
Blondie pushed Art into the back seat of the car and followed him in, while Buzzcut joined Davis in the front, still carrying Jessica's gun. Jessica waited only a moment after they drove off, tires squealing, gravel spitting. Then she ran to her car and sped after them. It wasn't long before she lost them. She pulled over and checked her phone. The tiny GPS tracking device she had just secured to her gun was sending a clear signal. She saw the blip representing Davis's car driving south, back toward Toronto. I'm coming, Art, she said. Hang in there. Charlotte was in her playroom, hair freshly braided, wearing a nice clean dress and playing with paper dolls. A long chain cut from an endless sheet of crisp white paper, hundreds and hundreds of them. She sat in a chair just her size with scissors in her hands, carefully freeing the little paper girls one at a time. Snip, snip. Each one fluttered soundlessly to the oatmeal-colored carpet as she sang. 1, 2, buckle my shoe. 3, 4, shut the door. The door to the playroom slammed. Charlotte turned in her chair, startled. The door was closed, but no one was there. Mother? She got up, frightened now, and hesitantly took a step toward the door. The door seemed to retreat. She took another step and another. Each step she took, the door moved farther away. Charlotte walked faster, but it was no use. She started to run, then remembered she still had the scissors in her hand. She stopped and looked down at them, guilty. The blades were red. With a sick feeling, Charlotte turned back to the chair she'd been sitting in. There, on the carpet, more red. The little paper girls. She'd cut them. No. I'm sorry. She started to cry, ran back and knelt down on the carpet, trying to put them back together. "It's all right," said her mother gently behind her. "It's not your fault. See?" Charlotte turned and saw Marion Bowles standing there, an endless string of paper dolls draping her like tinsel on a tree. But the paper wasn't white anymore. It was red, and it was dripping, spoiling Mother's white dress and the carpet. "Don't cry," said Mother. "You see, don't you? They were always red." Charlotte woke suddenly. She took a deep breath, sat up, and pushed back damp hair from her forehead. It was okay. She was better. These were just remnant nightmares as she slept her way through the last traces of the virus. "That was distressing," she said, testing out her voice in the empty room. It sounded raspy and rough. She remembered having some brownies. That explained the trippy dreams. One had to be careful at Aunt Casima's place when it came to baked goods. Always ask first. She was in the basement apartment at Casima and Delphine's. The familiar surroundings were soothing, if a little chilly, she noticed as she peeled the covers off her body. Still clammy with sweat. She needed a shower, badly, but she was going to need to eat something first if she had a prayer of standing up that long. One of Aunt Casima's fuzzy robes was draped invitingly over the back of the desk chair, right in her sightline. The gesture warmed her even before she wrapped it around herself, giving a little shudder of relief. There were voices upstairs, laughter. Carefully leaning on the rail, Charlotte climbed the stairs and found her way to the kitchen. 4 of her aunts were crowded around the island: Sarah, Allison, Casima, Delphine. It looked like a bake sale in there. The island was covered with muffins, cookies, and more of those brownies. Her stomach rumbled. "She's awake!" Casima had spotted her and gave her one of those classic, brilliant Casima smiles. It felt like forever since she'd seen her smile like that. Was this another fever dream? Some creepy dream within a dream situation? No. As woozy as she felt, there was no mistaking reality. She wouldn't smell of old sweat in a dream. What had she been dreaming before anyway? Something weird, spooky. She wasn't sure she wanted to remember. "How are you feeling?" Delphine asked. "Fine," Charlotte said. "And, hungry, thirsty, mostly thirsty." "I'm on it," said Aunt Allison, hopping up to grab a glass. "You want ice?" "Actually, no, I'm a little cold. Just some cool water is fine." Charlotte felt as though she were light years away as everyone tripped over themselves to fuss over her, commenting on how pale she was, bickering good-naturedly about what she most needed to eat first. "She's the whole reason I made the caramel brownies," Delphine insisted. "Oh, so these brownies were safe." "But you don't start off with a huge hit of sugar," Casima said reasonably. "She needs protein." Charlotte smiled faintly, torn between affection for her crazy family and the weight of what they didn't know. Would Delphine have made her brownies if she knew? "Peanut butter on crackers," said Allison. At first, Charlotte thought Allison was tossing out another of her sanitized curses. But when her aunt went to the cabinets and began assembling the snack, she realized she meant them literally. Charlotte suddenly felt queasy, which had nothing to do with her recent illness. And she knew it wouldn't go away until she did something awful, something she didn't want to do. But she had no choice. "It was me," Charlotte said. "I did it. I told them." The kitchen went quiet, except for the sound of Aunt Allison pulling crackers out of their crinkly plastic sleeve. "Did what, sweetie?" said Allison. Casima was staring at her, face blank. "Oh, shit," she breathed. "Charlotte," said Sarah. Her face twitched with preemptive rage. "Explain now." "I contacted the press," Charlotte said. "Well, Kira did. It was my idea, but I couldn't from the hospital, so she did the actual..." The peanut butter jar crashed to the floor and smashed open. "How dare you?" Ah, now Aunt Allison had found her rage. She also had a peanut butter-covered knife clutched in her hand, which made Charlotte nervous. "What were you thinking?" "She wasn't thinking," said Delphine crisply. She looked like she'd bitten into a lemon. "She was delirious. I wasn't, Charlotte protested. Well, I was. That was why I found the courage, but I wasn't wrong. All 4 adults stared at her in absolute shock. Delphine drew in an audible breath through her nose, opened her mouth as though to say something, and then just let out a gusty exhale. Delphine, Cosima began. I know, said Delphine tartly. I know. I can't. This is not my fight. Excuse me, I need to. She didn't say what she needed to do, but whatever it was apparently in her office, with the door slammed shut. 3, 4, shut the door. She was going to lose them all. I thought it was Rachel, Aunt Sarah said, her voice shaking with fury. That was the only person I could imagine who would be enough of a cold-hearted, vindictive bitch to... Sarah, said Cosima, turning to give Sarah a hard stare. Calm down. At least give her a chance to explain herself. Cosima turned back to Charlotte. Charlotte? Why? You know why. We've had this conversation before. Not that any of you paid the slightest attention. I beg your pardon? Allison interjected. No, it's my turn to talk, said Charlotte. Just listen for once. To her surprise, they did. The 3 of them stared at her like she'd grown horns. Do you have any idea what it's like to say perfectly sensible things over and over again and be ignored simply because of your age? None of you would ever even bother to tell me why what I was saying was wrong. You just refused to acknowledge it, as if nothing coming out of my mouth could possibly be important. Charlotte, said Cosima gently, I don't think we ever... You're doing it again! Dismissing me, patronizing me, and why? What makes you so much more reasonable than me? You never gave me one good reason for continued secrecy, never gave me a single positive for it. All you could say was that my idea would cause problems. Really? Cause problems? Well, to be fair, said Cosima, obviously making a Herculean effort at calm. It sort of has. Not sure how much you remember, but I remember enough. And yes, I agree, this sucks. But what about this whole situation didn't suck already? Being a clone sucks. No social media, no close friends. Don't introduce anyone, don't talk about it, don't let your picture get published in the school paper. She glared at them, letting her eyes move from Allison to Sarah to Cosima. I know you've all felt this way. It sucks. Sorry to be the one to say it, but it's true. And your answer is just to pretend you're not one and to hope the rest of the world plays along forever? It's not gonna work. She was yelling now, her throat raw. Social media, instant access to international news, hundreds of clones who don't know that they supposedly have to be careful about where their image goes, not even to mention the new biometric security. You think they're gonna roll that back? You all want to keep hiding even though it's ruining your lives and ruining my life and Kira's. You should have a say in what happens to us. That's all we've ever wanted. That and an actual future of our own. Charlotte ran out of breath, and maybe words. There was absolute silence. Allison suddenly noticed the knife in her hand and went to the sink to start washing it. Shite, Sarah said softly. Charlotte, you're right. Excuse me? Allison asked. For a moment, Charlotte thought she was hallucinating again. One of the clones had actually heard her and agreed with her, and it was Sarah, no less. Are you just humoring me? Charlotte asked. No, I'm finally listening. It's long overdue, and I'm sorry. Sarah patted the stool next to her. Come sit, let's talk. Really talk. Sarah looked down at her hands. You may not believe this, but I know how you feel. S not treating me like an adult is one of the reasons I ran away from her for so long. Of course, I wasn't acting like an adult either, but that isn't the point. I pushed her away, and now... Sarah closed her eyes and her voice trembled. Kira's doing the same to me. She opened her eyes and looked at Cosima, Allison, and then Charlotte. We need to listen more. All of us. You and Kira are a different generation with your own voice, and we can't dictate how you live your lives. Tears sprang to Charlotte's eyes.
Thank you. But just like me running away wasn't the right thing to do, telling the world our secret wasn't right either, Sarah said. I still disagree. Even though this screws everything up in the short term, in the long run, it is the right thing to do. The only thing to do.
Now who sounds like a lecturing adult? Sarah smiled.
Things are gonna get worse before they get better,
Cosima said.
But they always do,
Allison said.
Aunt Cosima, you were throwing away your career,
Charlotte said.
Aunt Sarah, you might like living off the grid, but Kira doesn't.
Sarah flinched.
Eventually we have to summon up some courage and deal with what we are. So go ahead, punish me if you want, as if the world isn't doing its best at that already.
The others were quiet for a long time. Allison turned away, unable to look Charlotte in the eyes, but Cosima got up, reached for her. Charlotte was still tense, still in fight-or-flight mode, but she was so exhausted that she relented. The hug felt better than it should have. She couldn't find the energy to hug back, so she just leaned into it.
This is going to need a much bigger talk,
Cosima said. I may be angry with you right now, but that'll pass. And I suppose the rest of this mess will pass too, one way or another. But I promise that I won't ignore you ever again, okay?
Okay. What are you going to do with me?
Charlotte said wearily over Cosima's shoulder.
Well, the first thing we're going to do, said Cosima, is feed you. But the very, very next thing, we've got to get you in the shower. You stink out loud.
Charlotte was surprised into a wobbly laugh. She loved them. She couldn't help it, even with all their stubborn pride. They were probably never going to admit she was right to out them, not in so many words, so this was as close as she'd ever get. For now, she'd take it. As dawn broke on a dreary morning, scattered snowflakes still stubbornly falling, Kira, Em, and Dana arrived at Nesweenek. The solar-powered streetlights blinked out as they arrived, which Kira hoped wasn't a bad omen. They walked with Kurtzman's briefcase open so she could track the locations of the 4 blips. She had been watching them converge in the center of town, where they had stopped moving. Something whined by Kira's ear. She ducked and looked for the source. She felt a sharp pain in her forehead and slapped at it. Something small crunched under her hand. She found a crushed metal mosquito on her palm. These tiny drones were more fragile than she'd expected. She prodded the growing welt on her forehead and examined the smear of blood on her finger. Do you suppose they inject everyone with the disease, or do they check their victim's DNA for a match before delivering the payload? She mused aloud. It's a marvel of technology for sure, but where are we going? Dana asked impatiently. So, are you a carrier now? Em asked. She slapped the back of her neck. Ouch! Am I a carrier? She sighed. I already hate these things. Are you saying we shouldn't interact with the villagers, just in case we're infected? Kira asked. Em shrugged. Judging from the telemetry, there are more mosquitoes than people living here, so I doubt they need human carriers to spread it. Fascinating, Dana said. But those blips are supposedly right in front of us, so where are they? And what are they? Kira looked around. They were standing in a small plaza next to a dry, snow-filled fountain. Across from them, 4 men dressed in black parkas, black pants, and black knit caps were standing conspicuously in a white gazebo. They carried steel briefcases just like the one in Kira's arms. She locked eyes with one of the men. His lips moved as he said something. Then he reached behind his back. Dark metal glinted in his hand. Take cover, Kira shouted. They're in the gazebo! She, Em, and Dana dashed toward the fountain and ducked down behind it. She heard a soft whoomp, and a piece of the fountain chipped off and flew over their heads. Awesome, Dana said. Just then, a man and a woman emerged from a cafe and wandered toward the fountain with steaming cups of coffee. Get down! Dana screamed. Someone is shooting at us! The couple were startled. They gaped at Dana like she was an alien. Oh mon Dieu! Is that one of those clones? the woman said. They backed away. The man dropped his coffee to take a picture of Dana with his cell phone. Are you serious? Dana pointed at the gazebo. They have guns. Kira abruptly felt guilty. Deep down, she hadn't expected the public to fear or hate the clones, but these two were clearly alarmed to see one of them there in their own village. Never mind that Dana was trying to help them from a real threat to their lives. The two villagers turned and ran. Well, at least they were leaving. Probably to go post that picture of a clone online. Come out, wherever you are, one of the men called in a sing-song voice as he left the gazebo brandishing his gun. Oh, never mind. We know where you are. Kira and Em huddled together while Dana tapped at her cell phone. What do we do? Em whispered. This time, she was the one who was trembling. We wait for reinforcements. I just texted Vivi, Dana said. She'll be here. Maybe we don't need to wait for the cavalry. Kira nodded toward the main street. A cluster of villagers was heading for the plaza, including her Uncle Felix. His face was mottled with red splotches, and he was clutching his bug zapper racket like it was the most precious thing in the world. Surely they won't shoot us in front of all those people. Why wouldn't they just shoot everyone? Em asked. They're trying to kill them anyway. Another mosquito buzzed around their heads. Dana swatted it away. Everyone stand back, the leader of the Black Ops team said. We've tracked a number of dangerous clones to this village, and we need to apprehend them immediately. Is this guy with them? A villager asked. He's been running around shouting about some crazy story about killer mosquitoes. Oh, he has? That definitely makes him a person of interest. Leave him with us. You leave Uncle Felix alone, Kira muttered. I need to get one of those briefcases in the gazebo. You won't be able to get anywhere near them without a distraction. Dana fell silent. Oh, crap. What is it? Kira asked. I'm the distraction. Dana smiled. Make it count. Hold on, Kira said. Dana stood up, hands over her head. Hold your fire, she called. I'll come peacefully. Vivi was busy being shot at by Greg Kurtzman when her phone vibrated. It was a message from Dana. In village, pinned down by gunfire from Kurtzman's men, help would be great. Vivi felt a rush of anxiety that Dana was in danger because of her. And not only Dana, but Helena was still out there being pursued by the helicopter pilot, and likely Felix, Kira, and Emmeline weren't doing much better wherever they were. Her whole plan to divide and conquer was going to hell. There was a reason she usually worked alone. She could get herself out of trouble usually, but other people were liabilities. She couldn't do her job if she had to worry about watching out for them too. Vivi peered around the tree she was using for cover and squeezed off a shot at Kurtzman. She doubted he'd want to be seen anywhere near Nazwineg, let alone with a gun, and she needed to help Dana fast. She was going to make a break for it. Vivi fired off another shot and then took off in the opposite direction. She darted around trees, trying to put as many of them between her and Kurtzman as she could. She heard bullets plink into the trunks of trees as she passed them. She had already been close to the village, on her way there to rendezvous with her group anyway, when she'd received Dana's SOS. So she was there in no time, taking in the quaint wooden shops and houses with disdain. There was a commotion down the main street, so she joined the mass of people working their way there. A small crowd, maybe 20 people, was standing in what probably passed for the town square of this pissant village. As Vivi trudged up, she heard another door slam and an older couple joined the group. Go back inside, she wanted to yell. Shelter in place, morons. Deadly airborne virus. But she couldn't because they were all watching Kurtzman's henchman, and he had Dana. The mercenary was standing behind her, one arm around her chest, his other hand holding a gun to her head. Dana looked absolutely terrified. Then Vivi got close enough to make out what he was saying. Seen them, you know what she is. She's a clone. Just like they sent GMO salmon to pollute your river and let pesticides drift in on the winds to corrupt your crops, now they've sent you GMO humans to destroy your village. Oh shit. The villagers murmured. A few of them held cell phones, recording the whole thing. Dana started yelling something in French. Vivi wished she could understand. That's it. As soon as we get out of this, I'm starting a language course. and I'm going to take it seriously this time, she thought. Whatever it was, the villagers were listening, at least. They were looking around uneasily now, but up in the air rather than at one another. Dana was telling them about the mosquitoes. Then a little girl spotted Vivi and pointed at her. Jesus, kids were out here. Vivi had forgotten that the virus was going to kill everyone in Nazwineg, even children. Apparently, clones sounded the same in French as in English, because that's what they were all yelling as the crowd turned and closed in on Vivi. "Vivi!" Kira shouted. "Behind you!" Vivi turned, expecting to see more angry villagers with pitchforks maybe. Instead, Greg Kurtzman was there, sweaty and out of breath, pointing his gun straight at her. "It's over," he said. Vivi could have disarmed him or dodged away easily, but her quick mental calculus told her there was a good chance someone in the crowd would get hurt instead of her. She didn't want any more guilt or blood on her hands on this mission. "Throw your gun over here," he told her, a smug grin on his face. "Then go join your sister." He jerked his gun in Dana's direction. She looked at Dana. Vivi could fight, and she would probably get away, but they would likely kill Dana. And then all the villagers in Nazwineg would die from the virus. Vivi couldn't abandon them like this, even if she didn't yet see how she could win by staying. She tossed her gun in the snow and walked toward Dana. "Sorry," Vivi whispered as she took her place beside her clone. Dana shrugged. "I made my decision, and you came when I needed you. Fat lot of good it's doing. It makes me feel better, having you here. Having you back in my life, whatever's left of it." Vivi thought she should probably say something along the same lines, but she didn't do sappy, and she wasn't sure she really did feel the same way. The sudden appearance of clones had endlessly complicated Vivi's life and effectively ended her career, unless she could make herself and her intelligence valuable enough to buy her way back home. The crowd was getting angrier, riled up by the sight of two clones standing side by side. Then Vivi spotted something that was really going to get them worked up. "We aren't the enemy. We're innocent just like you." Dana tried again to appeal to the villagers. "We're victims too. The way society and the government has treated you, ostracized and scapegoated, that's what my sisters and I are facing now. Don't be a part of that. Don't give in to ignorant hatred. These men are here to wipe you out, and they're using us to distract you. No clone is a threat to anyone." In that moment, Helena rushed over from behind the truck. She had lost her cap, and her hair flared wildly around her head. Her mouth was smeared with blood, but Vivi was reasonably sure it wasn't hers. People screamed. Helena caught Kurtzman by surprise, yanking his gun away and turning it to fire on one of his own guys. The man's knee exploded in blood and cartilage, and he went down, while his friends cursed and backed away, holding up their own weapons but not firing in case they hit their boss. Kurtzman struggled, but Helena still held his gun hand in a vice-like grip so he couldn't get away. Vivi moved in to back her up. She punched Kurtzman in the face, and he dropped like a sack of potatoes. So satisfying. She nodded at Helena. Helena smiled. "Yep, that was definitely someone else's blood, like some macabre lipstick. Creepy." The crowd erupted into shouts and screams, not because of clones this time, but due to the shimmering cloud of mosquitoes hovering around them. "See? I told you!" Felix lunged around with his racket in what looked like a comic ballet. He swiped at the air, collapsed into a snowdrift, and was up again to swing his racket. That time, it connected. Sparks crackled as the tiny drone immolated. Vivi whirled around. "Kira, the briefcases!" She had to recall the mosquitoes right away. Maybe they could at least save some of the villagers, if the ones already infected weren't contagious. "Where's Kira?" Em stood up from the fountain she'd been crouching behind. She pointed at the gazebo. Vivi followed her finger and saw Kira inside working over 4 open briefcases. A moment later, everything went quiet. No buzzing mosquitoes, no shouts. All around them, mosquitoes fell into the fresh snow. Vivi turned back to Kurtzman. "Now it's over." Still on his back, Kurtzman grinned at her savagely from the ground. "Don't be too sure about that. I have friends in high places." Vivi matched his expression. "You're gonna need them." We've won, Kira thought. As Dana explained to the stunned crowd what had happened, with the evidence of the mosquitoes all around them, the villagers' mood shifted, though they still kept their distance from the clones. Local law enforcement soon arrived to arrest Kurtzman and his men. Meanwhile, about a dozen villagers had started panicking because they had mosquito bites. They needed medical attention right away if it wasn't already too late. They needed a cure. Kira saw Vivi stoop briefly in the snow before she straightened again and started walking toward the gazebo. "Good going," Vivi said. "You'd make a terrific spy one day." Kira blushed. "I'm just glad it's over." "Mostly over. There's still a lot to do." Vivi nodded toward the briefcases at Kira's feet. "Be careful with those. The cops will likely want them as evidence." Kira looked down at the case. "Maybe you should be the one to turn them in." Vivi shook her head. "Probably not a good idea. Besides, this was your op. You should do the honors. By the way, your friend keeps glancing over here." Kira turned. Em met her eyes, and her expression was everything. "Go ahead," Vivi encouraged. "I'll be along in a moment." "Thanks, Vivi," Kira said before walking away. Em smiled warmly at Kira's approach and clasped her hand, sending a warm thrill through her. Beyond Em, she saw Helena and Dana chatting quietly, Felix talking animatedly with the police. Everything was going to be all right. But when Kira glanced back over her shoulder, Vivi had vanished.
You're listening to Orphan Black, the next chapter, starring Tatiana Maslany. Produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Orphan Black, the next chapter is written by Malka Older, Lindsay Smith, Madeline Ashby, Mishell Baker, E.C. Myers, and Heli Kennedy. Produced by Marco Palmieri and executive produced by Molly Barton, Julian Yap, David Fortier, Ivan Shebeg, and Carrie Appleyard. In partnership with Boat Rocker Media and BBC America. Audio produced, sound designed, and edited by Amanda Rose Smith. Based on the television series Orphan Black, produced by Temple Street, a division of Boat Rocker Studios. The theme music is by Two Fingers.